Good day, learners. Welcome to the discussion for preparation for paper 2 examinations. We want to focus on paper 2, question number 1 on settlement geography. So we're just going to discuss on key aspects and also highlighting key concepts which might assist in answering questions from paper 2. So I'm going to highlight on key aspects and also emphasize on key elements where we usually get our questions, or the nature of questions that we usually get on specific sections of question number 2, question number 1 for paper 2. Right. So as we know, we need to be familiar with the concepts because we get questions where we need to give definitions of concepts. So with settlement, we have quite a number of concepts that we need to be familiar with, and you should be able to define them correctly as per the geography definitions. Right, starting from here with settlement geography, the key concepts, we have a settlement, which is a grouping of people or buildings, communication networks, activities that function as a single unit on a daily basis. Or in general, we can say a settlement is a place where people stay and work, which means there is interconnection there and communication taking place, and also activity relating to each other with people and buildings staying as a single unit on a daily basis. That is basically a settlement. Then we have two aspects which are very important that learners usually confuse and that learners usually interchange wrongly. We have site of a settlement and situation of a settlement. Right. When we're looking at the site of a settlement, we are looking at the exact physical location of a settlement. The exact physical location of a settlement. So when we're talking of a physical location of a settlement, we are saying, where is the settlement located? So the physical location, we are saying, where exactly is the settlement located? That is the site of the settlement. We're looking at the physical location of a settlement. Where is it exactly? Then a situation, we are looking at the location of a settlement in relation to the things that are around it. It's no longer about the physical location, the exact physical location, but now we are relating the settlement to its surroundings. Where is the settlement in relation to other things which are surrounding that particular settlement? Is situated maybe adjacent to a river, or if the settlement is situated by the foot of the mountain, is situated at the gap on a ridge. That is the situation of a settlement. But the site we are looking at the physical location. Where is the settlement physically located? That is the site of a settlement. Then we have rural settlement as part of the classification of settlements. Rural settlement, we are saying, is a place where primary activities dominate. What are primary activities? We know that in a rural area, there is dominance of primary activities. And we are also saying it's a unifunctional settlement. Unifunctional meaning there is one common function. Right. When we're talking of primary activities, we're saying in a rural settlement, the dominant activities are primary, meaning to say we deal with raw materials. Examples of primary activities like farming, like fishing, like forestry, like mining. Those are the main activities that take place in the rural areas. And we are saying they are unifunctional. Unifunctional meaning that there is one common function that takes place in a rural area. We have one common function which is happening in that particular area. For example, can be a farming area, which means people in that particular settlement, their main activity is farming. If it's a farming rural settlement. Or if it's a fishery area, it means the main activity that people are engaged in is fishing. So we are saying its primary activity that dominating the rural settlement, and also it's unifunctional. Right, then we go to an urban settlement. Right, urban settlement here. We are now trying to differentiate from a rural settlement. This is a place where secondary and tertiary activities dominate. Secondary and tertiary activities. Secondary activities, we are looking at now the processing of raw materials. We have been talking of primary activities where we deal with raw materials, where we deal with nature. But with secondary activities, we are now saying we are now dealing with the processing of the raw materials. We are now doing activities which are involving the processing of the raw materials into finished and semi-finished products. For example, in the manufacturing industries, it's a secondary activity. And tertiary activities, we are saying we also have tertiary activities taking place in an urban settlement. Tertiary activities, we're looking at service provisions. Services like banking, services like insurance, services like medical care. Those are the activities that dominate in an urban settlement. And it is therefore multifunctional. Multifunctional, we are now saying there are many functions. In an urban settlement, we don't have one function. We have secondary activities which are diverse. We have quite a number of secondary activities that take place. We have different industries that produce different products. And also we have different sets of services that are provided. So it's multifunctional, meaning that there are many functions in an urban settlement. So you can see the difference there. The rural settlement has got primary activities dominating, and an urban settlement has got secondary and tertiary activities dominating. A rural is unifunctional, meaning to say there's one common function. An urban is multifunctional, meaning there are many functions. Right, let's go to pattern. It's the arrangement of buildings in relation to one another. That is a settlement pattern. Right, I will emphasize between settlement pattern and the shape of the settlement. So we are looking at the arrangement of buildings in relation to one another. How are the buildings located, or how are the buildings situated in relation to one another? Under the pattern there, we have two main patterns of settlements. Right. A settlement can be regarded as dispersed or can be regarded as clustered. We might have to discuss that later in other discussions where we are looking at those aspects in particular. But just in brief, the pattern we are looking at the arrangement of buildings in relation to one another, and we are saying a settlement can be regarded as dispersed. Dispersed, it means that the housing units or the buildings are far away from each other. Then clustered, you are saying the buildings are close to each other. Right, and the other activities like primary activities, we've talked about that. Secondary activities, we've talked about that. Tertiary, we've talked about that. Right, let's go to wet point settlement and dry point settlement. Right, what is it that we call a water point or a wet point settlement? Settlements cluster around a water source in dry areas. Right, usually we have confusion of differentiating whether a settlement is a water point or is a dry point. Right, when we talk of a wet point settlement or a water point settlement, we're looking at those settlements that were established for the sake of accessing water as a resource. We are saying there's scarcity of water in that particular area, and the reason for the establishment of a settlement is to have easy access to water as a resource. For example, in the desert areas, we tend to find that settlements are established close to the oasis, a place where water is found. Those settlements are regarded as wet point settlements because the reason for the establishment of the settlement there is to access water because water is a scarce resource in that particular area. So we can only be safe to acquire or to secure a supply of water by settling close to the water source. So that one is regarded as a wet point settlement. Then a dry point settlement, we are looking at settlements that are located away from the danger of water. in that particular area, there is risk of flooding. And then where should we stay? Where should we establish our settlement, given that the area is prone to the danger of water? We should try to locate high-lying areas which are safe from the risk of flooding. So the reason for the establishment of that particular settlement is because of the safety from the danger of water. So you are seeing the difference there. Wet point, water is scarce. We have to locate closer to the water source. Dry point, water is a threat. We have to locate at safer places away from areas prone to flooding. Right, let's go on. We have rural-urban migration. That one is simple. Rural-urban. We are looking at movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. That is rural-urban migration. Then depopulation. We are looking at the reduction in the total amount of people or in the total number of people. We have pull and push factors. Pull factor, we are looking at something that attracts people to a particular space. What attracts you is a pull factor, something which is attractive, which will lure you to want to stay in a particular area is a pull factor. Then a push, unfortunately here, it's my indication is wrong here. It was supposed to be a push for this one. Push. Pull is this one, yes. Force is that force people away from a settlement. If you are being pushed, you are being made to move away from a settlement, which means those factors are unpleasant for human survival. They can be harsh economic conditions, or they can be harsh social conditions, or harsh physical or natural elements, which would drive people away from a particular settlement. So that is the push factor. So push and pull, they act in the opposite. Pull factor is attracting, push factor is forcing someone away. Right. Then we have social justice. Every person deserves equal economic, political, social rights and opportunities. As a nation, all South Africans must be guaranteed to equal opportunities, economic opportunities, political opportunities, social rights. That is social justice. As a society, we must achieve equality in the society. There should be no one who is neglected. There should be no one who is like left out in terms of the opportunities. Then we have also social injustice. And we have social injustice in rural areas and social injustice in urban areas. When you're looking at injustice, social injustice is just the opposite of justice. When now we have people who are not having equal opportunities, we have some groups of people who are subjected to poor conditions. Like, for example, when you talk of rural injustice, we look at things like poor access to land. If there are people who do not have adequate access to land, that is injustice. It's a social injustice in the rural area. Or unavailability of clean and safe water for drinking in the rural area. It's an injustice because you are not achieving equality for everyone, for it is every human's right to access all the basics. But if there are some groups of people who are neglected, who are not getting access to those basic facilities, that is now social injustice. Right. Then land reform. Land reform we are looking at to address the unequal distribution of land in South Africa. Those are measures which have been put in place or strategies put in place to address unequal distribution of land. Land reform is a broad term, but the main purpose there is to address the problem of unequal distribution of land. So those are the measures which have been put in place by the government to try and redress the unequal distribution of land in South Africa. Then I also want you to note the difference here between land reform and land restitution. Right, land reform and land restitution, usually land restitution and land redistribution. There is usually a confusion between those two terms. When someone wants to describe or to define land restitution, they will end up redefining land redistribution. Or the opposite. You want to define land redistribution, then you define land restitution or land reform. Right. When I'm talking of restituting, in the first instance here, land restitution, what is to restitute? We are saying someone was dispossessed of a resource which was rightfully theirs, maybe because of the laws and the rules which were there during then. For example, during apartheid, we know of the forced removals. People were forcibly removed from their traditional lands. And also we can talk of the creation of the Bandustans. People were removed away from their original lands and put into the homelands. It means they were dispossessed of their land. Then when we are restituting, we are now giving back that land which was unfairly taken away from the citizens. It was originally their land, but because of the situation which was there, the political situation, they were forced away from the land. They were dispossessed of their own land. But when we are restituting, we are giving it back to the rightful owners who had lost it. That is restitution. Then redistribution, we are saying the state is giving out land to people who are disadvantaged. We are not looking at the original owners of the land or the rightful owners of the land here. We are saying there are people who are disadvantaged, who do not have access to land. We are not worried about their history, whether they had land before or they didn't have any land, but they are disadvantaged because they don't have land. We have to distribute to those disadvantaged citizens. That is redistribution. To achieve equality, we redistribute the available land. The state buys land and gives to its citizens. That is redistribution. So you see the difference there. Restitution, we are giving back to the original owners who were dispossessed of their land. Redistribution, we are just giving to people who are disadvantaged. Right, we move on to land tenure. Land tenure, we are looking at basically who owns the land. How is the land owned? Who has got the rightful ownership of land? So basically, we are looking at the laws which are used to own the land. Are you having the title deeds over the land? Are you the rightful owner? Or can you do whatever you deem with the land? Is it leased land from the state? That is the land tenure. We're looking at the laws which govern the ownership of land. How is the land owned? Right. So basically, those are some of the key aspects that relate to the study of settlements. Right. We are going to quickly go through the rural settlements, and also we go to urban settlements. Right. When we're looking at rural settlements, we are looking at the classification of rural settlements. If you are to classify the rural settlements, the classification of rural settlements according to size and complexity. Right. Rural settlements according to size and complexity. Size, we are looking at how big the settlement is. Complexity, we are looking at how many activities are provided in that particular settlement. For rural settlements, we have the smallest settlement, which is called an isolated farmstead. This is the smallest rural settlement classification. We are looking at the isolated farmstead, we are saying it's just maybe one homestead, which is in a farmland on its own. And there are no functions provided. There is just a homestead which is located very far away from others in isolation. So that is the smallest size of a rural settlement in isolated farmstead. Then number two, we go to a hamlet. That is the second classification of a rural settlement. A hamlet now, we're looking at a small grouping of a small grouping of homesteads. And maybe they can be maybe a church as a function. So we are saying a hamlet now is now relatively bigger than an isolated farmstead, but it's a small grouping. We cannot say it's a village, cannot qualify to be a village. Why? Because it's a small grouping of loose homesteads, which are just clustered together, and maybe there's just one function. Maybe there's just a church, or maybe there can be a store, a grocery store on that particular cluster of the settlements. That is a hamlet. It cannot qualify to become regarded as a village. Then the biggest classification of the rural settlement is the village. But when we're looking at a village now, it's more organized and it's now more pronounced. It provides quite a diverse number of services, which is now on a village. We are looking at the functions increase. The number of functions have now increased for a village. Maybe we have a primary school, and also maybe there's a clinic, and also maybe we find that there's a church, and maybe there's a grocery store. So you see now the functions are increasing, the number of services provided are now increasing. Though the services are more of a low order service or low order services that are provided in the village. But that is the classification. So when you get a question which asks about the urban hierarchy or the classification of settlements, you must always know that we start from the smallest going up to the biggest settlement. So the smallest, if you get a question which is asking about the ranking of the settlements according to size and complexity, it starts with an isolated farmstead, that's the smallest. Then it goes to a hamlet, then it goes to a village. The size will be increasing and also the complexity will be increasing, meaning to say the services which are offered in those settlements, they tend also to increase with the ranking of the settlement according to the hierarchy. Right, and also we have the classification of urban settlements, like what is indicated here. Right, when we go to urban settlements, we start with the smallest urban settlement, it's a town. Right, a town, basically, we have a number of towns. And usually the confusion that learners get is differentiating between a town and a city. Right. The differentiation here is also based on the size and also on the complexity of the settlement. For a town, we are saying the size is relatively small. It's a smaller urban settlement. And also, in terms of complexity, the number of functions is limited. There are limited functions in a town. And also, the order of the services which are provided, usually they are relatively lower order services which are provided in a town. That will give us the distinction between a town and a city. When you're now going to a city, you tend to find that now the size of the settlement is now bigger compared to the town. A city is now much bigger compared to a town. And the services which are offered there, they are now higher order services. For example, when you look at administration, we can find that we have provincial administration offices in the city. But in a town, we are likely not to have them. We can have only the municipal offices in the town. But in a city, we are more likely to have the provincial offices being located there. And also in some instances, the national offices or the parliaments being located in such cities because they are high order services. And also if we check, we also use the argument of the range of goods. Though we are going to discuss it as a particular section, when we are looking at the range, we are saying how far are people prepared to travel to get services which are offered in that particular settlement. So when you look at a town, people are prepared to travel relatively shorter distances to go into towns to acquire services there, because the services which are offered mainly are lower order services. And for a city, people are prepared to travel longer distances to acquire services which are offered there. Right. Citing as an example, you tend to find that maybe in a city, in a town, there can be maybe ordinary grocery stores where people need to buy the basics. People are prepared to travel shorter distances to go and buy groceries. It is unjustified that a person travels 500 kilometers to go and buy grocery. It does not make sense. But a person can travel 5 kilometers to go and buy grocery. So for a town, the range is smaller. People are prepared to travel smaller distances to get to the nearby town to acquire the basics. But for a city, for example, you want a specialist practitioner or a specialist doctor. You can be prepared to travel for over 200 kilometers to get access, because that one is a high order service. So we tend to find that the range for a city is much bigger compared to the range for a town. That is the other distinction that you can give there. Right. Then that is the second classification according to the hierarchy of urban functions. We go to the metropolis. As you can see here, the metropolis is now much more bigger. It's now an administrative city that is composed of a number of cities around. For example, we can give examples of Cape Town. It's now a metropolis. It has a number of towns which subscribe to it as the core of the urban settlement. So a metropolis we are looking at now is now a cluster, which is an administrative cluster of a number of towns which subscribe to the core settlement. Then moving on with the hierarchy, we have the conurbation, right? The conurbation here, though we have fewer examples in Africa, a conurbation we are looking at, in fact, is now a merging of metropolis, where metropolises are now getting to merge with each other. We no longer have distinct boundaries. We no longer have distinct physical boundaries that separate those two metropolises. Rather, they are coming together. They are coming to infuse into each other. The area is now completely built up such that we no longer have physical boundaries splitting the two metropolises. It's like two metropolises are fusing into each other because of continued development between them. Typical examples that we can give maybe for South Africa, we can highlight the Randburg area as a metro, as a conurbation. If you check, the area is now infusing Pretoria into Joburg, such that there is no more distinct boundary between the two. It's now getting to infuse each other into each other, though they are two different metropolises, but they are getting to merge with each other because of continued development between them. That is the fourth classification. Then we go to a megalopolis. Unfortunately, in Africa, we cannot talk of a megalopolis. We don't have a megalopolis. We are now looking at conurbations merging with each other to create a very large built-up area. For example, if you talk of the megalopolises in the developed countries, you can have a continuous built-up area stretching for over 400 kilometers. That is now a megalopolis. We cannot have typical examples in the developing world. We are not yet to that stage of development to get to have megalopolis. And maybe lastly, we can also talk of a world city as the last classification. There's also the world city. World city, we are looking at a city that holds the functions controlling the whole world. And typically, that can be when you check on the world scale, cities that hold the key functions like that have the offices of the United Nations and its arms like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, or that have offices of the arms of the UN like UNICEF. Those are the ones which we regard as world cities. They hold international functions governing the whole world activities. Right. So basically, if you get a question on urban hierarchy, you must be able to figure out how the settlements are arranged according to their size and their complexity. And you rank them according to their size. And also what you should note is at the bottom, we have the smallest, and at the top of the hierarchy, we have the biggest. Also, because of the numbers, the smallest settlement will be having the biggest number. We have so many isolated farmsteads and rural hamlets and villages compared to towns, and towns are more than cities. Cities are more than metropolises. Metropolises are more than conurbations, and conurbations are more than the megalopolis, going in that direction and in that size of classification. Right. That was with the classification of settlement according to the size and the complexity of the settlement. Right. We have talked about the pattern and the situation. We've discussed that. Right. Let's go to the functions of settlements. We have talked about rural settlements and the functions. We said they are primary and it's unifunctional. It just highlights the examples of primary activities that we find in the rural areas: agriculture, mining, forestry, and fishing. Those are typical examples that of the activities that dominate in the unifunctional rural settlements. Then we go to urban settlements. We say they are multifunctional, dominated by secondary and tertiary activities. And secondary activities will relate to manufacturing, the industries. And tertiary, we look at service provisions. And as examples given there of tertiary activities, we have education, health, transport, tourism, trade, warehousing, all those examples. There are so many. As long as the service provision is falls as part of the tertiary activities. Right. So that is an urban settlement. Then we go to pattern. We've also highlighted on the pattern of a settlement. We said we are looking at how the buildings are situated in relation to the other. And we have two main patterns. So the other confusion that you might have in the examination, do not confuse a question on pattern with a question on shape of a settlement. Those two are not the same. When a question is asking about the shape of a settlement and a pattern of a settlement, be able to differentiate between the two. Whenever I talk about pattern, remember we have two patterns. We have a dispersed settlement pattern. Dispersed meaning to say the houses or the units are far away from each other, and we have clustered or nucleated, which means the units are close to each other. Like what you can see here, these buildings, they are located relatively far away from each other. And check here, they are far away from each other. That is dispersed or isolated. They are in isolation away from each other. But when you're talking of cluster or a nucleated settlement, like you can see these ones, now it shows that the buildings are very close to each other. Like for example, you talk of the high density townships, there's nucleation there. You talk of the informal settlements, the buildings are too close to each other. But if you check in the rural areas, the homesteads are relatively far away from each other. Maybe you might find that it's a kilometer away from the next homestead, which will mean that it's a typically dispersed settlement, and clustered or nucleated will be located just as close to each other. Right. So if you get typical questions like the one that we have here, which is referring to the photo A and B, name the patterns A and B. You can actually see that on A, here the pattern is dispersed, and here the pattern is nucleated according to how the buildings are located. How do settlements A and B differ in their size and complexity? It's a simple question. In size, you know that this one is a smaller size, this one is a bigger size. And complexity, again, in this one here, it's less complex. There are fewer functions provided here, and here it's multifunctional. Right. Let's move on to site of a settlement. What determines the site of a settlement? We said with settlements, we have site and situation. Site, we are saying, is the exact physical location of a settlement. Where is the settlement located exactly? that is the site of a settlement. So for us to establish a place to have a settlement, there are factors that we must consider. We must consider some factors for the establishment of a settlement. Like, for example, the availability of fresh drinking water. We know that water is a basic requirement. So when you're establishing a settlement, we must also figure out if there is availability of fresh drinking water. It's a factor which determines the site of a settlement or flatland to build on. We all know that it's expensive to build on steep sloping lands, or to develop infrastructure. It's also very expensive in steep sloping lands. So as a factor, we consider developing land settlements on sites which are relatively flat. And also maybe if it's rural areas, we also check on grazing land. Remember, we said rural areas are unifunctional and they're dominated by primary activities. If it is, for example, livestock production, we are doing farming, we also need to check if there are grazing lands for livestock. Then also soil, fertile soil, it's also another factor for farming. And also source of energy. We need to check on fuel. For example, is there availability of wood in the area? If it's a rural area, we need to establish a source of energy that we're going to use. And also, we have slope aspect relating to climate and weather. We have the microclimate aspect determine where the warmest slope is. Remember the south-facing and the north-facing slope. When you're looking at slope aspect, it's also another factor that is considered when we want to establish a settlement. So basically, these factors are summarized here. Fresh water is there, fertile soil, grazing land, building, and fuel. So all those are the factors that influence or that determine the site or the location of a settlement. Right. And here it distinguishes between a wet point settlement and a dry point settlement. Like what we have mentioned earlier on, a dry point settlement is established for the safety from the risk of a flooding. So we tend to establish the settlement at a point which is safer, like what you are seeing here. Right. This settlement is situated at a high-lying area because this area is low-lying and is prone to flood, river that frequently floods. And you tend to find that another settlement established here, this is a relatively high-lying area, which will mean that if these settlements were established in this area here, this area is frequently flooded. So the reason why those settlements were established there is to locate away from an area which is prone to flooding. So to avoid the risk of flooding, the settlements have to be established at safer and high-lying places. That is what we call a dry point settlement. Then a wet point settlement, like you are seeing here, on this illustration, the distinction I think is clear. You see, this is a water source, and settlements are established around the water source. These houses are located around the water source. So it's a wet point in the sense that water is a scarce resource in that particular area. For example, in arid and semi-arid areas, water is a scarce resource. We cannot locate 5 kilometers away from the water source. We have to locate as close as is possible to the water source because water is a basic resource that is needed on a daily basis. So we cannot locate or locate a settlement far away from the water source. It will mean that settlements will develop around the source of water because water is a scarce resource in the area. The area maybe is an arid area, it's a semi-arid area where water is scarce. So you see the distinction between the two, a dry point and a wet point. You don't need to confuse those two. In dry areas, we have wet point settlements. Like in deserts, settlements are established at the oasis for the need to access water. But in areas that are prone to flooding, talk of KZN areas, people don't settle in low-lying areas because those areas are prone to flooding. They locate in high-lying areas for the safety from the risk of flooding. So that's the difference between those two. You must be mindful of the distinction of those two types of classification of settlements according to relation to water. Right. Then we move on to patterns of rural settlements. We have rural settlements which are dispersed and rural settlements which are nucleated, just highlighting on the advantages of nucleation and the advantages of dispersion. Right. Looking at rural settlements which are dispersed, we are saying the housing units are far away from each other. What are the advantages of farmers locating away from each other in the rural area? One farmer is here, the next farmer maybe is 3 kilometers, the next farmer is 4 kilometers away. What is the advantage of that type of settlement in the rural area? Right, I will just highlight on the advantages, but we are not limiting to the ones which we have here. Right, there's an issue of privacy to making your own decision. Privacy meaning to say whatever you do, you are doing it in privacy. There is no interference from the next person because they are far away. You make your own decisions as a farmer. You can decide the nature of farming that you want to do. You can implement all the possible strategies that you want to implement on your farm without any external influence because you are away from the next person. And the farmer also owns all the profit. It implies that the farmer is using his or her own land where he is situated and is able to get all the profits from the production taking place. Then there's more accessibility to tools and machinery. It will also imply that there's no sharing of equipment here. If you are located away from the next person, it means you use your own equipment, you use your own machinery without sharing with the next person, right? And also, land is not fragmented, therefore it saves money on traveling. It means the land here, the farmer is staying on the very same land where they are doing production, and it will save time and also save on money for traveling. If the farmer is located away from their place of work or the land that they use for farming, it will mean that it will cost them more time and also money on traveling to go to the farmland. But in this instance, if you are having a dispersed, it means the farmer is located where he or she is doing a farming, which will reduce the cost on traveling for the farmer. Right, we'll move on to the disadvantages. There's no interaction with other people, though there's privacy, but also interaction is needed. If you are in isolation, you don't have interaction. It is not safe to be alone. You are vulnerable to farm murders. I think that is prevalent in South Africa. We have instances of farmers being raided by robbers. And in that instance, if you are away from the next person, you won't be able to get help from the next person because you are far away, which is also a threat. And also, it's difficult to share ideas where there are problems. If you want to maybe have a challenge with your farming, you need some consultation. It is also difficult to have such information because the next person is away from you. Then nucleated, we are saying these farmers are located just close to each other in a cluster like that, which will imply that they have somewhere where they do farming. This is only a residential area, the area of residence where they stay in a cluster, meaning to say they are always traveling to go to their farmlands from the area of residence, which is now the opposite of here. Here we are saying the farmers are located where they do their farming. Maybe farmer A is having that land, farmer B is also using that, farmer C is using that, farmer D, like that. But these ones, they are together here, and it means they have to travel to their farmlands where they do production. So the advantage is that there's interaction with people. You can see if you're in a cluster, you are constantly with each other. So interaction is very frequent. And also safety, because of them being in numbers close to each other, they have got safety and also sharing of ideas. It means they can interact and share ideas on how to tackle some challenges in their community and in farming. And sharing of tools and machinery, it's possible to share machinery because you are just in close proximity. Right, the disadvantages, no privacy, arguments can arise and conflict. The more you interact, you end up having misunderstandings and also incidences of conflict arising amongst the farmers. And cannot use tools and machinery when you want to. Because of the problem of sharing, there might be other farmers who rely on other people's machinery, which will give a disadvantage to the owners. They might not be able to use their own machinery because it's hired out to the next person who does not want to return. Right. And sharing of profits. Yes, there's instance of sharing of profits there. Usually they do collective farming. You farm together as a society, which will also imply that you have to share whatever proceeds come from the farm. So basically, those are the advantages and the disadvantages of such types of patterns of settlement in the rural area of a dispersed and enucleated. We usually get questions on that where you are tasked to give the benefits and the challenges of dispersed or nucleated settlement. So you must think along those lines whenever you get a question which is tasking you to look at the challenges of farmers in that pattern and farmers in the other pattern. Right. Then we go to shapes of settlements. Right. We have quite a number of shapes, but figuring out the shape is basically easier because the name suggests how the shape looks like. If the shape is round or circular, we know a circle or a round, which means the units are located in a circle around a feature. Maybe there's a key point of interest for the settlement. Maybe there's a church or there's a water source. Then settlements, they develop around that source of attraction, giving a circular shape, like what we are seeing here. And linear, the word linear from line. Settlements are established in a line. What makes the settlements develop in a line? Maybe they are following a major route, a road or a railway line on the side of the major road or on the sides of a railway line. They will end up having a line shape or a linear shape. Or we are saying they are following a river. They will establish along that river and they will form a line. That is a linear settlement. Then crossroads, we have a crossroad. A crossroad, we are saying we have two roads which are crossing each other, and settlements, they develop along those routes, creating a cross. Then a T-shaped settlement, like the name suggests, the letter T, we have one route linking onto the other, like that. And the settlements will develop along the routes, making a T-shape. Then we have a star-shaped or sometimes called a stellar. Right. It's basically a stellar from star. We know how a star looks like, something like that. And you have settlements developing along the routes like that, giving a star shape. That is basically on the shape of settlements. Right. I'll move on to um, rural settlement issues, social injustice, including land reform. Right. Rural urban migration, we have talked about that. People moving from rural areas going to urban areas. And in urban areas, you're looking at cities and towns. People moving away from the rural areas going into cities and towns. That is a concept that you must properly define. And what is the main factor? The main reason is related to the availability of job opportunities. Given the fact that people in rural areas have got a belief that they can find jobs in the urban areas, they tend to move away from the rural areas into cities and towns for the sake of job opportunities. And the reasons can be on the push side, like what we mentioned earlier on, push or on the pull side. Push factors, we are saying people are forced to move away from the rural areas. And pull factors, we are saying they are attracted to the urban area. So summarizing those ones, we just have to look at the basic reasons that that push people away from rural areas. There are natural causes or the physical causes, like natural disasters, for example, flooding or droughts or earthquakes. Those are natural push factors. People in rural areas tend to move away because of those factors. If there is a risk of flooding or if there is a severe drought, people's livelihoods are negatively affected and they tend to move to urban areas. That is a physical push factor. Then if we look at also the push and pull factors, which are economic, we can look at such things like poor salaries, no investments, decrease in production, poor infrastructure. If you are looking at it on the push side, we are saying, if you are talking of salaries, on the push side, we are saying it's poor salaries in the rural areas. If you look at the farm worker salaries, they are too low. And then a pull factor in the urban area is better salary. If someone is gainfully employed in a town, the salaries are better than for the farm workers. So it's a push factor if it's poor, and it becomes a pull factor if it's coming from the urban area. Or if you can talk of poor industrialization or poor infrastructure. Infrastructure is poor in the rural area and is better in the urban area. So poor infrastructure is push and better infrastructure as pull factor. Or if you can talk of housing, you can mention housing is poor housing as a push factor in the rural area, but it's a social one, and better housing in the urban area as a pull. So we can also check on other examples like education. How is the education like in the rural areas compared to the urban area? The quality of education tends to be poor in the rural area. It acts as a push factor, and better education in the urban area becomes a pull factor. Health, you check on the health provision, how it is like in the rural area compared to the urban area. It acts as a push and it pulls on the other side. Right. What are the results? If we have massive migration, rural urban migration, what is going to happen in the rural area and also in the urban area on the other side? If you are looking at issues in urban areas, right? When you're looking at this particular section here, usually we get questions which ask on the consequences of rural urban migration. And usually the questions are specific. A question can come requesting for economic consequences of rural urban migration or social consequences. You should be able to differentiate the consequences. Which ones are the results which are economic, which results are social, or which results, whichever dimension is asked in the question, you should be able to figure out are the right responses according to the requirements of the question. Right. We're just going to look at some of the impacts of rural urban migration. And remember, it's two-sided. It has effects which are positive and which are negative on the rural area and also on the urban area. Like for example, it mentions of decrease in investment. This is a negative implication on the rural area. There will be decrease in investment. Why does investment decrease? One, because of labor shortage in the rural area. If more people are migrating, it means the productive workforce is lost, and that will lead to labor crisis and also contributing to disinvestment and decrease in investment levels in the rural areas. And also because of reduced buying power. You cannot invest where people don't have money because they won't be able to buy the products. We have the problem of aging population. This is a social factor. Aging population, we are looking at the elderly remaining in the rural areas. How is it a problem? We have the elderly remaining. They are left without people who care for them. Because if you check the people who migrate, we are looking at people in the economically active age group between the ages of around 16 to 59 there, which is the productive age group, are the ones who are most likely to migrate. So they will be leaving behind the young and the elderly. And if you check, these ones are dependents. The young, they depend on those who are working, and the elderly also depend on those who are working. So we typically have a problem of aging population in the rural areas, where we tend to have more of the elderly people staying alone in the rural areas, while it's those ones who are productive have left the rural areas to go to cities and towns. Then also we have an imbalance in the age-sex structure. An imbalance will arise. We end up maybe having more females in the rural areas compared to males. Typically, men migrate more to the urban areas. We have men migrating more, leaving behind women in the rural areas. At the end, we have an imbalance in the rural area where we have more women to men, giving social problems related to the imbalance in the age sex structure. Right. We have also neglect of infrastructure. We have a problem that we call the development of ghost towns. That is the typical geographical term which is used there. It leads to the development of ghost towns. When we're looking at ghost towns, we are saying initially it was a settlement where people used to stay. But because there is intense migration, the buildings are neglected. There is no more occupation of the buildings. So they are just left abandoned. That is what we refer to as the ghost towns. Ghost towns, typically we experience them in the mining areas. In mining areas, we have those compounds where mine workers stay. If the mineral gets finished, there's no more incentive for people to keep staying where there's no production. They will leave those buildings and move to the next spot where there's still activity. So those buildings being left abandoned, they are now termed a ghost town. Right then, the closing of business and other services. Businesses will close because of reduced buying power, and also the services will also close. Remember, we have what we call the threshold population. We're going to look at that when we look at urban settlements. Threshold population. If, for example, a business is operating in a particular area, it has a minimum number of customers that it needs for it to make profit. If it fails to attain that minimum number, it means that business won't be running profitably, and the only thing to do is to close it. If the population falls below what we call the threshold population, we're going to look at it in detail when we look at the concepts relating to urban functions. Right, then the depopulation of rural areas. Depopulation, we are saying there is ultimate reduction in the numbers of people staying in rural areas. And that will lead to underdevelopment of the rural areas. If there's depopulation, the people who are supposed to do productive work in the rural areas have left the areas. That will stagnate the economy of the rural areas, or even it will decline. Right, we move on to other aspects. What can be done to keep people in rural areas? This is a typical question which you usually get. Solutions. It can come on the perspective of the government. What can the government of South Africa do to reduce rural urban migration? Because we have seen the negative implications of it on the rural area. It will cause quite a number of problems in the rural area. At the same time, creating also problems for the urban areas. So there's a need to balance the two to retain people in the rural areas so that there is production taking place in the rural areas. At the same time, we are also trying to control the level of urbanization in cities and towns so that we don't have typical urban settlement issues which are caused by extreme migration of people from rural areas. So we can talk of different approaches which can be taken to try and reduce the problem of rural depopulation. Right, job creation, projects in rural areas. The government can initiate projects to create jobs for the people in rural areas. Decentralization of industries. I think we know of industrial decentralization. We are moving away industries from the core industrial areas into surrounding rural areas so that people will get gainful employment and will stay and will retain those people in those rural areas. Then we can also talk of development corridors. Like, for example, we can talk of the development of the SDIs. Right, we are saying rural areas which are linked by major routes they must be we must have our developments along those major routes. We must have activities taking place along those major routes, and that should retain our people in the rural areas. And so also improved basic services. Basic services, they must be improved. If we talk of basic services like water provision, people in rural areas must have access to safe and clean water, or also education. They must have access to quality education, healthcare. The government must try to ensure that there is access to those services in the rural areas so that people will stay safely in the rural areas than them moving to urban areas. And also skills development. Some people move to urban areas to acquire skills, to go to academic institutions to acquire skills. If we have skills development initiatives in the rural areas, that is also going to be a move that is going to assist in reducing rural urban migration. So there are so many other measures that can be put in place. So when you're answering such a question, it's a common question. Ensure that you give a sustainable and attainable strategy, something which is within the geographical reach and which is attainable and sustainable in the long term. Right. We move on to this was a research was issues of rural urban migration. Then the other thing that we need here is also to have a discussion on the social justice issues, which is land reform. We have discussed land reform, where we said these are the initiatives that have been taken by the government to try and address the injustice of the past, which were created by apartheid laws, where there was unfair land ownership. And how is it done? We are doing it through land restitution and land redistribution, and also through a land tenure, which we said are the laws governing how the land is owned. Right. And when you're looking at this typical aspect of land reform, we need to assess the effectiveness of the process of land reform in South Africa. That is a typical question that you get. Assessment on the effectiveness of the land reform. Is it really working? Has the government achieved its objectives of redistributing land or restituting land to the previous owners? That is subject to debate because we can argue in favor of the success of the government and the overall success of the land reform process, or you can also look at the negative implications which have been brought by the attempt to redistribute land. Like, for example, why are people unsuccessful? People who have received land, why are they unsuccessful? We have quite a number of people who have received the land from the government, but they are still not making it. Right? The reasons that are cited there, like, for example, people do not have the required skills and knowledge to make a success for farming business. You get land today, but you don't know anything to do with farming. At the end of the day, it's the waste of resource. We have put resources into the wrong hands. We give a person without skills. The government did not afford the people skills, required skills. You cannot give someone land without the knowledge of how to use the land. At the end of the day, it's a waste. And also, government support is limited. The new farmers, they need support, which can be technical or financial support. They need to be assisted with farm equipments and farm implements, and also they need to be assisted with funds for the viability of their projects, and also conflict amongst traditional leaders. We also have traditional leaders conflicting with the farmers, or they need to control them, or they need to implement their control over the resettled farmers. Right. So it's part of why are people failing to make it while they were beneficiaries of the land reform program. And then what can be done is the opposite of what we're talking about. Then we can move on to some positives of land reform. What positive impact has it brought to the people? What positive impact has the land reform brought? It will reduce poverty and increase quality of life. Yes, people who have received land, they are now out of the poverty bracket. And also the quality of life is improved. People are now able to access basics, and also it encourages sustainable growth. I think it's clear. It increases efficiency of people, especially farmers, increases production, and therefore more exports. Those are the benefits of land reform. Right. Then now we move on to urban settlements. Under urban settlements, we need to look at some few concepts. We have urbanization, which is an increasing percentage of the total population living in urban areas. Urban growth, number of people living in urban areas increase. Urban expansion, the area that in urban area, the physical area increases over time. I want you to give a distinction between urban growth and urban expansion. The difference there, urbanization, are looking at increasing numbers of people staying in cities and towns. That is urbanization. We are having an increase in the number of people staying in cities and towns. That is clear with urbanization. Then urban growth, we are worried about the number of people. The people in the cities are increasing, which is caused by natural factors. And by natural factors, we are looking at the birth rate being higher than the death rate. And also, which is caused by rural urban migration. Or we can say net migration, net internal migration, or net migration rather. Right. In urban expansion, we're looking at the physical, we're looking at the buildings, the area which is now occupied by the urban settlement. If an urban area is expanding, we are having a built-up area which is stretching outwards or which is extending outwards. That is urban expansion. So urban growth deals with people, urban expansion deals with the physical space occupied by the urban area. Then break of bulk develop where one type of transport are replaced by another. For example, from a railway to a road or from road to sea. Like those coastal towns, they are break of bulk points. Then junction town, where there's a joining of transport route, not the same type of transport. A junction town develops where there is the joining of transport routes and specifically the same type of transport. Then also a gap town, a gap, like we know a pass on a mountain range. We have towns developing there, or where there is a major crossing point across a river, we have a bridge town developing there. Right. What is urbanization? We've talked about that. Reasons, we've talked about that. Right. And also these other concepts. Urban expansion, we've talked about it. The physical area occupied by the urban area. Urban growth, we've talked about that. We've talked of the number of people. And the rate of urbanization. When something is rated, we are looking at the speed. How fast or slow is it happening? That is the rate of urbanization. How fast are people moving from urban areas to moving from rural areas to cities and towns? That is the rate of urbanization, whether it's slow or fast. Then level of urbanization now is the percentage of people out of the total population who are staying in cities and towns. So the level, we're looking at it as the percentage. 60% of South Africans are in cities and towns, which means we are saying out of the total population, what percentage or what fraction is staying in cities and towns? That is the level of urbanization. So those concepts, you don't need to confuse them. Make sure you are specific with which one you are answering. Rate of urbanization, are looking at the speed at which urbanization takes place. Level, we're looking at the percentage of the total population who are staying in cities and towns. Urban expansion is actually the physical growth of urban areas. Physical, we are saying the space which is occupied by the buildings or the built-up area in the urban area. Then urban growth, we're looking at the number of people who are staying in urban areas as a result of natural growth or net migration. Then urban sprawl, it's another concept which is very important. Urban sprawl, when something is sprawling, it's uncontrolled and shapeless or formless. Something which is uncontrolled, or which is shapeless, or something which is formless. That is sprawl. We are saying urban areas are growing, but they are expanding in an uncontrolled manner. They are growing, but without proper planning. Like, for example, the sprouting of informal settlements is typical example of urban sprawl. The informal settlements, they are just built anyhow, anyway, without plan. That gives the urban area a shapeless form. So that is typical example of what we call urban sprawl. The urban area grows in an uncontrolled way or in a shapeless or a formless way. Right. Those are the key aspects. Site and situation, they are almost related to the rural areas. Right. Then classification of urban settlements according to function. Right. We have the classification of settlements here. We have what we call the central places. What you should note with the central place, unfortunately, we cannot look at the central place theory by Walter Crystal. That one is not part of, is not examinable, if I'm to say. Right, but there's a theory which is called the central place theory by Walter Crystal, which tries to explain how urban functions act as central places and the sphere of influence for the central place, while and also the range of the central places. Is a theory which tries to summarize how our central places are function. Right, but for this instance here, let's look at a central place as a concept. Right, we are looking at a central place. We are saying it's an urban area which provides services to the surrounding rural area. Service to surrounding rural area. It's an urban area specifically that provides services to the surrounding area. And if we look at um, urban functions, we have those towns which are in the rural areas. For example, in South Africa, a typical example can give example of Uppington. Uppington is a central place. People in the surrounding area, they get all their services in that particular urban function. Then it acts as a central place. That is a central place. Then we have a trade and transport town. These are towns and cities that develop at points where transport routes meet. We've discussed that. Then a break of bulk towns, we are saying there is breaking of bulk which is taking place. Like for example, in those coastal towns, goods are brought in bulk quantities via water transport, the cargo, and they are broken down into smaller units so that they can be transported over road or over rail. Then also gap towns, we've talked about that. And we have specialized towns. When you talk of a specialized town, we are saying in that particular settlement, there is one main activity which led to the development of that particular town. The development of that settlement was centered on one core activity. That is a specialized town. There's one main dominant function. For example, we have mining towns. Mining towns, we are saying the main activity that led to the development of that settlement was because there was mining taking place in that area. And that will ultimately lead to the settlement developing. Or we have recreational towns. The main activity there is recreation. Maybe there's a tourist attraction facility that attracts people to that particular settlement. And at the end, the settlement develops. Or we have education towns. Some settlements develop because of maybe there's a major university in that particular settlement, which attracts people to that particular settlement, leading to the development of the settlement into a town. That is what we call a specialized town. So we have quite a number of examples of specialized towns. Right. So you should know the classification of those settlements according to the function. Right. And we also move on to the urban hierarchy. Right, the ranking of urban areas according to criteria of size, number of functions, the degree of specialization of the functions. The more people and functions a town or a city have, the higher the hierarchy it will be. We have discussed that earlier on about the hierarchy of a settlement. Right. We have what we call low order functions. Right, low order functions and high order functions. We have low order goods and low order and high order goods. Right. We have low order sender and high order sender. When you're looking at low order functions or low order goods, it can come as low order goods or services or functions. Right. When you're looking at a low order, sometimes we call them conveniences, convenient goods or services. Those are the low order. When you're looking at low order functions, we're looking at those goods or the services that we require almost on a daily basis. They are regularly needed for survival. Anything that you can think of that you need on a regular basis, almost on a daily basis, is a low order function or a low order good or a service. For example, foodstuffs like bread, milk, all those examples of foodstuffs. You require them on a daily basis. Those are what we call the low order goods or the low order services. You require them on a regular and almost on a daily basis. Right, then higher order, we're looking at those goods that you do not require on a regular and on a daily basis. You require them occasionally. At some point in time, you need them, but you cannot need to get them every day, or you cannot buy them every day. Right. The other decision that you give is when you are buying convenient goods, these ones here. When you're buying convenient goods, you don't take, there's no considerable effort in the decision to buy. No considerable effort in making a decision to buy them. You cannot decide or you cannot struggle to think of where to buy bread. You just buy bread from the nearest facility available. Or you cannot go around town doing window shopping for bread, comparing prices of bread. You just buy where it is convenient for you, or you just buy from the nearest facility that is available. Because it's a low order function, it's less priced, and you don't need to make comparisons around. But when you're looking at higher order goods, there's need for considerable effort here in buying. For example, if you want to buy a phone, you cannot just buy a phone without thinking properly. You need to have considerations of quite a number of things. The quality, whatever, the specifications. You need to take considerable effort in buying high order functions or getting high order goods. So basically, that's the distinctions of the low order and the high order functions. And if you can check here, the examples that we have, like a washing machine, you can see here. A washing machine is not something that you need to buy every 2 weeks or every week. You buy a washing machine once, it lasts for the next 3 years. Or a car. You don't buy cars the same way you buy bread. You buy bread every day, but you buy one car in 10 years. So these are high order. Or if you look at an example here, this couch here is not something that is required on a daily basis. You just decide to buy once and it's not something that is required on a daily basis. Right. So that's the classification of goods according to whether they are low order or they are high order. Right. Then the concepts which are based on lower and high order function, we have what we call the sphere of influence. Right. The sphere of influence, we are looking at, if we are looking at geomorphology, we would relate to this as the catchment area. if it was geomorphology. The same way you understand catchment area, try to apply it to the sphere of influence. We are looking at people who are supporting a service. Where do they come from? The area where the people come from who support a particular service. If it is a school, it has its sphere of influence. We are looking at, for a school, where are the learners coming from who get the service of education at a particular school? That area surrounding that school where it draws its learners from, that is its sphere of influence. The same way you understand catchment area. Right. And we have what we call a threshold population. Threshold population, we are looking at the minimum number of people required to support a service and make it profitable. Right, relating the sphere of influence to low order and high order, you tend to find that for a low order, the sphere of influence is small. People who support the buying of low order goods, they just come from nearby, not very far, because people are not prepared to travel longer distances to get low order services or goods. It is unjustified to travel for 5 kilometers to go and buy milk or to go and buy bread. You just buy at the nearest possible sender. So the sphere of influence for a low order is relatively smaller, but for higher order, people are prepared now to travel for distances to acquire high order services. Like if a person wants to buy a car, they can travel for 300 kilometers to go and buy a car. So the sphere of influence now is bigger for higher order goods or services. Right. Then if we look at a threshold population, we are saying is the minimum number of people required to support a service and make it viable and profitable. So for high order functions, like for example, a furniture shop given here, you tend to find that the threshold is bigger. We need a relatively larger number of people to support a furniture shop and make it profitable. And for a spaza shop, it's just small. A spaza shop can service a small community and can still sustain and be profitable. So that's the difference there with threshold population. The threshold is bigger. We need more people for high order services for it to be profitable. But for a low order, just a few people can support it and make it profitable. Then the range, we're looking at the distance. How far are you prepared to travel to go and get a service? The range, again, if you check the range for low order goods, it's a smaller range. People are prepared to travel for smaller distances to go and get basic needs. But for high order, people are prepared to travel for longer distances, which will increase the range. So high order, if got a higher range, or if got a bigger range, people are prepared to travel longer distances to go and acquire specialized services. Right, so that is how you should interpret those aspects. And most importantly, you should know the definitions of those concepts because we usually get these questions as part of the matching question or as part of multiple choice questions. So you should be able to understand the concept first and relate it to low order and high order services and senders and goods. Right. So this one is just summarizing. Right. The only difference here that we need to note when we're looking at low order senders and high order senders, the difference is a function is a service or a good which is provided. And when we're looking at senders now, we are looking at the actual settlements. A low order sender, we are looking at a settlement that provides fewer services and low order services. For example, a small town is a low order sender. Then a city becomes a high order sender where there are variety of products and also where there are specialized services which are provided. Right. Then we move on to land use zones. This is also a very critical area that you must master. When you're looking at land use zones, we are looking at what specifically is the land being used for. What is the main activity taking place in a particular section of an urban settlement? That is land use. So each area has got a dominant or specific purpose, or has got a main activity that takes place in that particular urban sector. So, right, we want to look at the land use zones and briefly discuss how they appear and where they are located as part of an urban settlement. We have what we call the Central Business District, or the CBD. Like you can see here, this is the core of the urban area, featured by high-rise buildings, these skyscrapers, like you can see. This is typical of the CBD. What are the features? Is the most accessible. Most accessible here, a lot of people have been asking, why are you saying we have typical injustices in the urban areas? We have problems like traffic congestion, but we are saying the CBD is the most accessible. The reason why we say it's most accessible is theoretical, because the CBD is linked by major routes from right across the urban area. That is the accessibility part. But if you are talking of the injustices like traffic congestion, it's not easily accessible because of the level of traffic. But theoretically, we are saying it's the most accessible because all roads, they lead to the CBD. That's the concept there. And also land values. The land is very expensive. Why this land is expensive is because of competition. The land is used for commercial purposes. The land is used for business purposes. And therefore, because of limited space, the land values are very high. And also, we have the tallest buildings. Why do we have tall buildings? It's because we cannot have horizontal expansion there. The only way to expand space is vertical. There is no more space in the urban area to expand horizontally on the ground, but the only space available is to expand vertically upwards. That is why we end up having very tall buildings in the CBD. Right, then the functions, we have retail shops, financial institutions. We can talk of all those things that happen in the urban area, all those services offered in the urban areas. They are very diverse. We have banks, we have lawyers, we have administrative offices, we have retail shops, we have saloons, we have chemistries, we have dry cleaners, we have all those functions are found in the urban, in the CBD. And the problems that we find, typical problems or issues with the CBD, traffic congestion, limited parking space, noise levels, crime. I think that is evident in the major cities. Like for example, in Joburg, we have a very serious problem of crime because of the levels of the size of the population there. If you talk of noise, it's a very noisy space. And also if you talk of parking space, there is very limited parking space because the volume of traffic there is beyond the capacity of the CBD to contain. Talk of traffic congestion, those are typical problems that we find in the CBD. And these problems will lead us to the fact of decentralization of activities. That is why we end up having commercial activities being decentralized. Right. Then we have commercial decentralization. Why are we decentralizing? We've talked about decentralization. We are now moving activities from the CBD to the outlying business district, which we call the OBD, outlying business district. Because of those problems that we have mentioned or that we have identified, now we are moving out commercial activities from the CBD to other outlying centers. Like for example, the malls that we have. We now have shopping malls away from the CBD. We are now developing shopping malls away from the CBD. That is an example of decentralization of commercial activities. What we used to find in the CBD, we are now finding it out of the CBD in the malls. Like for example, banks. If you want to do banking, you can not sacrifice to go to the CBD. You can just go to the outlying business district at a mall. You find those services being provided there. The reasons for the development is between the distance between residents and CBD. Some people would be traveling longer distances to go to the CBD. So those malls, they are now helping in reducing the distance. Then traffic problem, I think is evident. Land values. Also less space in the CBD. Like for example, parking space is not readily available, but in the outlying business district, the space is available. And also for the sake of crime, safety, there is less crime in the outlying business district. It's more safer than in the CBD. And also talk of noise, level of noise is also lower in the outlying business district. That is why we tend to have the development of the outline. And I understand typically the question of decentralization, it's a common question in which you should justify. We usually get questions which asks about the rationale for decentralization. Why are we now decentralizing commercial activities out of the CBD? You have to justify. Right, then we have the retail shops. That one doesn't matter much. Let's go to the zone of decay, which is another land use zone. Zone of decay or the transition zone. In this zone here, it's a zone which is found just outside the CBD. Like if you check major CBDs or pronounced CBDs, there is a zone which lies outside the CBD, which is mainly having buildings which are unattended or which are illegally occupied. That is what we call the zone of transition. It has dilapidated buildings and it has neglected buildings, but it's just on the edge of the CBD. And also, if you try to check that area, it has got mixed functions. The area does not have a distinct use, but it has mixed functions. You tend to find that maybe there are some residential flats and also there are some light industrial activities taking place there. The functions are slightly mixed, but we are looking at that area which is just outside the CBD. And usually we get a question which asks you to justify why do we have neglected buildings in the zone of transition? Why do we have buildings which are unattended in the zone of transition? And those areas, they are littered, they look deserted, they are unattended. We have those Nyaupes staying in those areas. We have typical problems of graffiti on the walls and the buildings are unpresentable. And also, if you check, some of them are illegally occupied. People just invade the buildings and occupy them. Why is it that we have those? It's a typical question that is usually in the examinations, which wants you to justify why the buildings are not maintained in the zone of transition. Why is it having that problem of decaying? That is why we call it a zone of decay. The area is actually decaying. Right? Some of the reasons are given. Municipality has no jurisdiction over the buildings. They are privately owned. Some of those buildings are owned by private individuals, some of whom are dead, and they did not leave anyone to take charge of those buildings. And also some of the buildings are owned by people who are out of the country. And those buildings were left in the hands of people who are not worried about maintaining those buildings. Or some of them, they are preparing to sell those properties. They are just waiting for the CBD to expand into that area so that they can sell the buildings at a higher price. So they're not worried about the current status of the buildings, but what they are waiting for is they are waiting for commercial activities to invade the area, what we call invasion and succession. You know, when the CBD is growing, the functions are going to extend into the outlying business, into the zone of transition. So the moment the CBD expands into the zone of transition, those people are going to get higher prices for their properties. So they are not maintaining them currently, waiting for the invasion and succession from the CBD so that they can sell them at a higher price. And also it says people that stay in the buildings cannot maintain it because it's too expensive. Like for example, if people are just renting, they cannot take maintenance of the building. They just stay in it as it is. The maintenance cost lies with the owner, and the owner is neglecting the building. So at the end, we tend to have the zone of transition having such kind of buildings. Right. The activities indicated here, like what I've said earlier on, and the problems, pollution, decrease in investment, the problem of crime and prostitution, that is where it happens there, and also overcrowding and slum conditions. Right, that is the zone of transition. So it's the CBD. As we move out of the CBD, we go into the zone of transition. Then we go to industrial zones. And industrial zones are divided into two. We have light industries and we have heavy industries. I will just summarize this because it's also part of economic geography. It's going to be discussed in detail under economic geography. Here it's just under settlement. It's just the aspects of land use. So heavy industries and light industries, they differ. Where do we have light industries? Light industries are usually closer to the CBD or to residential areas. Why? Because they cause little pollution in terms of noise or in terms of air. So they are compatible with the CBD and also compatible with residential areas. What examples can we talk about as part of light industrial activities? We can talk of furniture manufacturers. We can talk of clothing manufacturers, shoe manufacturers. Those are examples of light industrial activities. Then when we talk of heavy industries, we are looking at those industrial activities that cause a lot of pollution in terms of air pollution, noise, and they require large space for their operations. These ones are not compatible to the CBD or to the residential areas for those reasons. And also some of the activities are very dangerous. They cannot be located close to residential areas or the CBD. They locate far away from the residential areas and the CBD. Examples there you can mention steel manufacturers, you can talk of chemical manufacturers, all those activities that require large space and cause lots of noise pollution. That is another zone of industries. So if you get a question on industrial zones of residential, usually it comes under map work. If it comes on the map skills, what you need to note there, the justification of the location of an industrial area, if it's a heavy industry, know that it was located there because of it being away from the CBD and the residential area. And also justify this availability of space. They should locate where there is enough space for expansion. You should check on the map again. And also, if you're also checking on the map, check also the nature of the slope of the landscape. They locate on relatively areas that are flat, which makes it easy for expansion and also the development of infrastructure. And also check if it's the justification on the map. Check also if there's availability of water resources there because you have industrial activities, they resort to the usage of high amounts of water. So you also need to check on those things and be able to justify the location of a heavy industrial area. Then residential areas, this one we cannot waste much time there. Residential areas, we are looking at places of residence of the urban citizens. Where do they stay? We have classification of urban residential zones according to the level of income. The low income, the middle income, and the high income. And we can also talk of informal settlements. Because informal settlements, we cannot classify them as part of low income because they are not planned. Low income residential are planned. They are formal settlements, but informal, they are unplanned and they are illegal. Right. So when we're talking of the classification of urban of residential zones, we classify the zones according to the level of income, and that is justified. You stay where you stay because of your level of income. It's not out of choice, but it's because of out of your economic status. You cannot stay in an area that you cannot afford. So residential areas are classified according to the level of income. So when we're looking at low income residential areas, we're looking at those areas like our common townships. Our common townships are typical of low residential areas. What kind of buildings do we have there? What kind of facilities? What kind of services do we get? How are the houses like? You can justify that by relating to our common townships. So you find that the houses are close together and the houses are relatively small. And also there's poor service provision, like the roads are not very good. And also the properties are small. That is typical of low income residential areas. Then if you look at middle income, the spaces are now bigger. The houses are now more bigger, and also some of them with gardens, and also they have garages. And if you look at the appearance of the area is usually an area which is which has a pleasing views. And then if you look at high residential income areas, those areas are now isolated away from the CBD because those people can afford to travel using their own modes of transport, going to the CBD for their economic activities. And also, if you check the nature of properties, they've got very big properties. And also, if you check on service delivery, there's the best service provision there in those areas. You understand? Right. Then we go to informal settlements. Informal settlements, though, is an aspect on its own, which has to be looked into. Right. We have typical issues with informal settlements. Those are illegal areas where people tend to settle themselves outside the jurisdiction of the municipality of the area or the authorities of the area. People just invade land and settle themselves. What typical nature of housing units do we find there? We have houses built out of plastic, wood, and zinc, and people staying in unhealthy conditions where there's no service delivery, where there's high levels of poverty, and also high levels of crime. That is typical of informal settlements. But what you should note here with informal settlement zone is that informal settlements are not planned for. These ones are illegal. It's just people settling themselves without the authorities' consents. That is why we have no service delivery or very poor service delivery and people living in unhealthy and overcrowded conditions. Then why do we have such a zone in an urban settlement? What prompts the development of informal settlements? The typical problem is housing shortage. The development pace is not catching up with the level of urbanization. At the end of the day, we have a deficit in the supply of housing, and people will opt to house themselves in the informal settlement. And also, if you talk of lack of job opportunities, it is cheaper to stay in the informal settlements. If someone is unemployed, it's relatively easier for them to afford paying rentals for the informal settlement because they are relatively low. And also rapid increase in the size of population in the urban area because of intense rural-urban migration. A lot of people are believing that there are opportunities in the urban area coming to urban areas from rural areas, and to find that is not true. And at the end, they become desperate, and the only option to sustain is to stay in the informal settlements. Then also can blame the municipality for poor planning. Right. So this is part of industrial, this is part of residential zone. We have summarized the residential zone, and our residential zones are classified according to the level of income. And also, if you check the low income residential areas, because of the level of income, sometimes they are located closer to industrial areas, and also sometimes closer to the central business district. One, for ease access, these people in the low income residential areas, most of them, they do not afford their own transport. They need to walk to their workplaces. That was why those low incomes, they were designed to be closer to the industries and also to the CBD. But if you talk of middle and high, they are far away from the CBD. These people can afford to have their own transport, and they do not want to stay in crowded areas. They want to stay in areas which have got space and which are healthy and unpolluted. But informal settlements also, because of lack of planning, they can be anywhere. Informal settlements can even locate in areas which are at a very high risk of flooding, because this is just invasion of private land or state land. So informal settlements, they are not compatible to anything because they are not planned for. They can locate even close at the industrial area or even close at the CBD as long as there's space, because this is illegal. There's no compatibility with informal settlements. So the questions that you can get, usually if it's map work, you can get a question which asks you to identify whether an area is a middle income or it's a high income, or it's a low income or a high income or informal. You need to find justification from the map. Like, for example, if you see the size of the properties and the nature of the buildings on the orthophoto map, you will be able to figure out by the size of the property and also by the size of the buildings. You tend to find that where we have those smaller properties, where we have smaller buildings, it resembles that it's a low income, typical of our townships. But where you find that a mapped area has got large properties with gardens, probably with bigger buildings, it shows that the area is a middle to high income. Then informal settlements, you can also figure out by lack of planning, where you see there is not even proper roads shown on the map, or the nature of the housing that is shown there, it resembles that is made up of cheap material, like houses built up of those zinc on plastic and wood. You can actually see that this is typical of informal settlement. Then you need to justify from the given map information that you'll be using there. Right. Then we go to the other land use zone, which is the rural urban fringe. The rural urban fringe here, we are looking at a section where urban functions are invading a rural area. The activities taking place in this particular area, they are meant to benefit people in the urban area. But the activity is taking place in a rural area. So that is why we call it a rural urban fringe. There is now a fusion of urban areas into rural function. Urban functions are invading a rural area. Right. What activities are we likely to find in the rural urban fringe? We have, for example, the airports. We don't find airports in the CBD or in a residential area. They are far away, almost in the rural area. But who is the beneficiary of the airport service? Is mainly the people in the urban area. It's an urban function which is invading a rural area. Or if we talk of cemeteries, not the old cemeteries, but the current cemeteries. We know that in some cities, we have those old cemeteries which are almost close to the CBD. That was then in the 1960s when there was still space. Now we cannot find cemeteries close to the CBD or close to the residential areas. Cemeteries are placed far away from the residential areas because there's no more space. So the cemeteries will be meant to benefit people coming from the urban area, but they are now located in the rural area. Or if you talk of golf courses, they are located again in the rural urban fringe. Or if you look at sewage works, the sewage treatment plants, they are located far away from the residential areas and the CBD. They are almost in the rural area, but they are serving the needs of the urban residents. Right. If you check these activities here, why are they locating in this zone here? The reason is because of availability of space and also land value. The land value is cheaper because it's now land which is part of the rural area. And given that these activities require large spaces, they cannot find that space in the built up area. So the only way to locate them is to locate them away from the built up area. And also if you take off, for example, the sewage works, it's also because of health hazards. We cannot locate a sewage works close to residential areas for health purposes and maybe for the smell that comes out from the sewage works plant. So this is typical of rural urban fringe. We can also add other activities like the rifle ranges. The rifle range is also an activity that takes place in the rural urban fringe. Right. So usually when you are getting a question, when you get a question on, you usually get questions on the justification of the location of a sewage works. The sewage works in block what is ideally located. Give a justification. That is part of map interpretation on settlement. The justification that you should give there is if it's ideally located, it must be located away from residential areas. You check the distance between the sewage works and the next residential area or the next built up area. It's ideally located, it must be away from the built up area. And then the justification there Why is it ideally located? The reasons that you give the justification of your health concerns, you give the justification of the smell, and also you can give the justification of availability of land for expansion. If the area shows that it's a flat area which has potential for the sewage treatment plant to expand in future to cater for the increasing population, then that is the justification that you give for the ideal location of a sewage works plant. Right. That is with the sewage works and the zone of the rural urban fringe. Right. So basically, those are our land use zones that we tend to find on in an urban setup. Right. Then we also need to check on the street pattern. The street patterns that we regularly have is a grid, which is a rectangular, and a radial, which is a circle, and a planned irregular. Right. Planned irregular, it shows that shape there, whereby there's no defined pattern. The streets do not have a defined pattern. Then radial, the streets are radiating from a focal point, out of a focal point, like what you can see there. Then rectangular or grid is the most common, which was used in the old towns. It's also like that, where the streets are giving blocks which are regular. Right. Then the other thing is the urban profile. When we're looking at the urban profile, we're looking at um, the side view of a city. As we come from the CBD, you can see that the CBD has got the tallest buildings, like what we've mentioned earlier on, and the reason. And we got the zone of decay, which is just outside what we call the zone of transition. Then you can find light industries. We say they are compatible with the CBD because they do not cause much pollution. Then we have the residential area, and then we have the green belt. And here you can also say the high-rise buildings. This is decentralization of commercial activities. We have this one. This might be a business park, which is outside the CBD because of the decentralization of commercial activities out of the CBD. Then you can have industrial activities. Then you can have the rural urban fringe away from the um, CBD, very far away from the CBD into the rural area. That is basically the urban profile. We're looking at the side view of a city or a town. Right. I think models of l- models of land use zones, of urban structure, the urban morphology. Basically, what is required here with the models of urban morphology, you do not need to uh, get into the details of each and every model. You need to have the basic understanding of how the model looks like, and maybe the justification and the applicability of it to our situation. But for our South African situation, these models here, they are not very relevant. The multiple nuclei is relevant, but the concentric model, the gas concentric model, we don't need to waste time on it because it's not applicable, that model. The only model which is applicable here is the multiple nuclei model, which was done by Harris and Ullman. This one justifies the existence of decentralization of commercial activities. That is why we end up having multiple nuclei. We end up having a number of core centers for the same for the same built up area of the same urban settlement because of industrial decentralization, because of commercial decentralization and industrial decentralization. We end up having multiple nuclei. Multiple nuclei, we are saying we have many focal points. It's no longer that an urban area has got one CBD. We now have a number of focal points because of decentralization. That is basically what is explained by the multiple nuclei. And activities grow around the focal point, which is the nucleus. So by us having a number of nucleus points, nuclear points, we also tend to find that we end up having activities appearing in activities happening around a core or focal point according to the distribution of the focal points by the decentralization happening from the main CBD. Then what is most concern is the South African land use model. And the South African land use model, it's the legacy of apartheid. We can actually see that in South African cities, the land use is basically split according to races. And also, if you check the nature of development in the areas in South African cities is different according to races again. So everything that we see in South Africa, the model is trying to explain the legacy of apartheid in South African cities. Because of the policy of separate development, and also because of the need to separate races away from each other, South African cities have got distinct areas for distinct races. The townships that we have in South Africa are for Africans. All the major townships are for the blacks. And if you check the township life, there's underdevelopment, there's extreme poverty, there's lack of planning, there's inadequate infrastructure, there's poor service provision, which is still a legacy of apartheid because of the separation of races. And we also have areas specifically for the Indians. It's still evident that there are areas which are dominated by the Indian race and areas which are dominated by the colors. And then we have the white areas, which are the best areas. So if you check South African cities, they have got that distinction, they have got that separation of land use zones according to the apartheid practices, which was a key factor controlling development in South African cities. So this model basically tries to explain the legacy of apartheid on South African cities. Then we go to the last part, which is issues relating to urbanization. The problems which are brought by urbanization to the cities of South Africa. Right, typical problems that we find, we have the problem of traffic congestion, which is typical during the peak hours. You tend to find that the volume of traffic will be very high, and that will cause a number of problems for the commuters, like delays to get to the workplace, reduced levels of income, reduced production because of the delays which are caused by traffic congestion. And also we can talk of other problems like traffic rage. It's also a typical problem that is found because of the level of traffic on the road. And also you talk of poor public transport is an injustice. And also the cost on fuel. Because of the level of congestion, it will also lead to high fuel consumption, which is a cost to the commuter and also a waste of time. Then we have the problem of overcrowding. It's a typical problem. And the resultant effects, we have problems like the spread of diseases. And also we have social evils, which are caused by overcrowding conditions. Social evils like crime, like prostitution, those are typical problems which come from the main problem of overcrowding in urban areas. Right, we have problems of housing shortage. Housing shortage is leading to the development of informal settlements. It's a typical urban settlement issue. Then we also have service provision. Resources, there's pressure on resources. Resources like water, electricity, they are in critical shortage supply because of the pressure that is being posed by the ever-growing population in urban areas. And also, if you look at services like healthcare, like education, there is pressure in those service provision. You tend to find that in public hospitals, there is always there are always very long queues because of the problem of rapid urbanization. Then we also have other issues like urban blight. We've talked of the zone of transition where there's decay Urban blight tries to explain the situation whereby there's poor maintenance of buildings in the urban areas and also illegal occupation of buildings. It will lead to urban blight. The urban areas will develop into slums where the buildings will become dilapidated and will be abandoned. Then also have the inner city problems. Inner city problems, we are looking at problems typically that are experienced around the CBD. Because of rapid urbanization, we tend to have typical problems which are experienced around the CBD, like crime at night, usually because of depopulation in the CBD. It's not safe to be in the CBD at night. The criminals will be taking charge of everything because there will be less people in the CBD. It's a typical problem which is caused by rapid urbanization. And also congestion of people and traffic. It's not even easy for one to travel or to walk around the streets because of the level of congestion which is posed by the people in the traffic, and also problems like noise and air pollution. And also the city becomes unattractive. If you check the major cities in South Africa, they are no longer attractive because of the problem of rapid urbanization. There are so many people and they are causing so many negative implications on the nature and quality of the environment in the urban area. So typically, the typical questions that you get on issues with the urban, rapid urbanization, you get questions like identifying problems which are associated with rapid urbanization. And you might also be asked to find solutions to those problems. What can be done? And commercial decentralization is one of the major activities, one of the major solutions which can be implemented to counter the problem of rapid urbanization. Or identifying the problems and the impacts, therefore. Like, for example, those who wrote the Gauteng June examination, there was a question on congestion. It was a cartoon which was explaining something to do with traffic congestion. You were supposed to identify the problem, which was in the cartoon, and also it was a photo rather. You were supposed to identify the problem, and also you were supposed to explain the impact of the problem. There was traffic congestion and the problems which were going to be caused by the traffic congestion, and also the solutions which would be put in place to counter the problem. When you're dealing with issues like traffic congestion, you can try to think along the solutions which can be put in place. Like, for example, using public transportation, using those public buses, they can reduce the problem of traffic congestion. So it is not only focusing on the problem, but also finding a solution to the problem. Right, then I think the last thing that we need to look at is informal settlements, though we have looked at them in passing. The informal settlements and the likely problems that are experienced there, just in our discussion. Right, when you're looking at informal settlements, you just need to be worried about the quality of life of people in the settlements. They are exposed to extreme poverty. They are exposed to unhealthy conditions. They are also exposed to criminal activities. So it's a challenge or it's an injustice for people in the informal settlements. And also the solutions, what can be done to the informal settlements to solve the typical problems that are experienced by the people. That is where you talk of the government's initiatives through the RDP project to try and provide decent housing, low-cost decent housing to the people. It's an initiative and an attempt. And you have to give an evaluation of its success or its failure in most instances. Is the RDP project actually working for the better of South Africans? We still have more informal settlements developing, while the government is claiming to be solving the problem through construction of decent, low-cost housing. Where is the problem? You have to justify the successes or the failure of the government initiatives to solve the problem of informal settlements. And also, if you check some of the informal settlements are being formalized. The government is intervening in trying to formalize those informal settlements, trying to bring in infrastructure, trying to bring in proper planning, and also trying to bring in water supply and electricity. But in another dimension, that is also promoting the sprouting of development of informal settlements. The way you try to formalize them, the more they develop. Because people will be having a hope that if they occupy private land, the government will intervene on their behalf and legalize that settlement. So it's a matter of justifying, and it's a matter of arguing in a direction. And whichever way you argue, you should argue in a sustainable way, argue in a way which has which has a geographical sense. So basically, that is what you should know under paper 2, question number 1, settlement. We have just touched on the basic elements of the study of settlements, and we have just addressed some of the basic questions which are asked under that particular section. So it is my belief that the discussion is going to assist you in your preparation for exams and also in your studies. Thank you.